Should Randy Boissonnault still be in cabinet?
Well, I can tell you that the business that Mr. Boissonnault was involved in was never on the Indigenous business directory.
Do you think he should still be in cabinet?
That's not a decision for me to make, Mr. Ginnis.
Okay. It's interesting that you're not saying yes. Do you endorse his conduct as minister?
I can tell you that Mr. Boissonnault's business was never listed on the Indigenous business directory.
He's a cabinet colleague of yours. You work together closely, I would presume. I ask if you think he should stay in cabinet, and you're declining to answer that. Do you endorse his conduct as minister? What do you think of what he has done?
I can tell you that GHI, the business that Mr. Boissonnault was co-owner of, has never been on the IBD.
Okay, I think you're saying a lot by not saying a lot, Minister, so I'll move on to my next question. Is Global Health Imports still eligible to receive government contracts?
I believe they are, but they are, as I said, not part of the Indigenous business directory. I can't answer in affirmative.
They represented themselves as Indigenous owned. They did so falsely. They are still eligible to receive government contracts. Do you think there should be penalties for companies that misrepresent their Indigenous identity? Should they be prevented from bidding further on government contracts?
In fact, there are penalties for fraudulent behavior, and I would hope that anybody that is procuring on behalf of the Government of Canada is careful about which businesses they procure from to make sure that proper business practices are followed. And certainly the Government of Canada has measures that it can take if it's found that businesses have acted fraudulently and should.
Okay. You mentioned there are consequences for fraudulent activity, which I hope would include misrepresentations around Indigenous identity. Did Global Health Imports, in your view, as the Indigenous Services Minister, engage in fraudulent activity?
I can't make that determination, but I can tell you that the Office of Supplier Integrity and Compliance with PSPC can take steps such as banning a business from future...
Sorry, I'll just jump in because I know there are options available, but okay, you don't want to rule specifically on the case of Global Health Imports. Let's take a hypothetical case where you have a company involved in health imports, let's say, that's owned by two people. Hypothetically, one of them happens to be a minister of the Crown, and they are bidding on government contracts and in the process claim to be an Indigenous-owned company. That claim turns out to be completely false. If that hypothetical company, in the process of pursuing government contracts, falsely claimed to be Indigenous-owned, would that be considered fraudulent activity?
It could possibly be, but that would be a decision by the Office of the Supplier Integrity and Compliance. I don't run that particular organization, so I would say that from my perspective, when there's allegations of fraud, it's very serious. And I think departments have a responsibility to ensure that they're procuring from companies that are not fraudulent. So
right, but just definitionally, right? Like it would seem that the definition of fraud is misrepresenting the facts in some way in order to achieve a commercial advantage. Right? Pretending something is true when it's not in order to achieve a commercial advantage. So you have a company that pretended to be Indigenous owned when it wasn't Indigenous owned. The purpose of that pretense was clearly to increase its chances of getting government contracts that it wouldn't have otherwise gotten. Is that fraud?
What I would say is I think we're saying the same thing, that the process of ensuring that people claiming indigeneity should be with integrity, because what we want is we want Indigenous economic success. So I think we agree. And I think that any time that there's fraud in terms of allegations of identity, that is a very serious infraction. Now, what happens next is up to places like the Office of Supplier Integrity, but I can tell you that we, on our side, in Indigenous Services Canada, take integrity around indigeneity seriously. Although it
Okay,
is a
and let me jump in here. I would hope
piece
the
of
Prime Minister would take that integrity seriously and fire this minister from cabinet. Just in the time that I have left, Minister, are there any other companies owned by Liberal cabinet ministers or MPs, former MPs, or Liberal appointed senators that are on the Indigenous business list?
Oh, that's a great question. I don't know the answer to that, but we can commit to checking that out for you and getting the information back.
Okay, thank you. I think the committee would agree that we're interested in receiving that in the usual timeline, a list, the names of any companies on the Indigenous business list that are owned by Liberal MPs, cabinet ministers, appointed senators, or former MPs.
Thank you very much. Mr. Barrett for 5, please. Minister, today Canada's first Indigenous Justice Minister and Attorney General, Jody Wilson-Raybould, who, as you know, was fired from cabinet by Mr. Trudeau for speaking out against and trying to stop his attempted obstruction of justice. She issued a statement online, and it said, "A prime minister committed to true reconciliation would have removed Randy and the other Randy from cabinet long ago. Instead, we get to watch white people play ancestry Wheel of Fortune. So shameful and extremely destructive." Do you agree with that characterization?
What I would say is that Indigenous identity is any use of Indigenous identity in a fraudulent way undermines Indigenous people.
Okay, so we have a member of your cabinet, a member of your caucus, who a 50% owner of a company that claimed to be wholly Indigenous owned, applied for government contracts under that false pretense. To dispense with the pleasantries, Randy Boissonnault lied about who he is in order to profit, and in doing so, attempted to disenfranchise legitimate and actual Indigenous-owned businesses. Do you think that that is appropriate? And if you don't think it's appropriate, do you think that he should remain in cabinet?
What I would say is that GHI, the company in question, was never on the Indigenous Business Directory.
Right, and so they applied.
I cannot, for example, weigh in on what decision points were made when GHI was awarded contracts. And so I can tell you, though, with very high degree of confidence that he was not on the list that defined indigeneity.
So he wasn't on the list. We know that he has previously said that he was Indigenous. He is now saying that he is not. So we know that he applied for a contract saying he was Indigenous. And this is the point that Ms. Wilson-Raybould has made. And it certainly undermines reconciliation. Would you agree that a cabinet minister claiming indigeneity to win government contracts and remaining in cabinet undermines the government's stated goal of reconciliation?
Well, I think Mr. Boissonnault's statement is on record, but what I can say is what I've just said, which is I think that when people utilize false claims of indigeneity, it's extremely harmful to Indigenous people, and it's extremely harmful to the process of reconciliation.
So thank you for that. Unfortunately, the Prime Minister, Mr. Trudeau, said this morning, "I'm happy that he, Randy Boissonnault, is continuing to lead on issues around jobs and employment and represent Alberta in our government." So you agree that it's harmful. The Prime Minister doesn't. So do you agree or do you disagree with the Prime Minister with his delight that Mr. Boissonnault, who is a fraudster, is continuing to represent Alberta in the government of Canada, in your cabinet, all the while attempting to disenfranchise Indigenous individuals and Indigenous-owned businesses?
Well, I think what is important here is that it's not up to me or any other person to police people's indigeneity. And so for
Well,
me,
he
this
said,
isn't
he's,
about,
Minister,
this isn't
Minister,
about,
he said, it's not for you to police. He said he lied. So he's the one who said he lied. You know that he lied. And you just need to have the moral clarity to say that what he did was wrong. It undermines reconciliation. And that type of fraud is unacceptable in your government. The rest of my time to Mr. Jennings.
Are there any instances of companies facing consequences for Indigenous identity fraud that you can identify?
I don't think I can answer that question. As
Okay,
I
I'll go
don't-
to something else, but if you could provide us with a list afterwards of any instances of companies that have been faced consequences for Indigenous identity fraud and what those consequences would be. It's been reported that Randy Boissonnault's claims that his great-grandmother was Cree, that those claims were false. Those were claims that he personally made in the House of Commons. They have now been revealed to be false. Do you have any comment on that?
My comment stands. The issue of indigeneity, is not for me to determine who is Indigenous, but that in general, claims of
Okay,
indigeneity
Chair, and
that are false
in
are very
the
harmful
seconds I
to
have
Indigenous
left,
peoples.
the minister in the last round referenced the Office of Supplier Integrity and Compliance as being able to answer certain questions that she has not able to answer. I wonder if there'd be agreement for us to hear from the Office of Supplier Integrity and Compliance at some point to help shed some further light on these things.
You seem to be in agreement. That is your time. Go to Mrs. Block for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair, and welcome to all of you joining us here today. Minister, we have heard repeatedly from Indigenous groups that the majority of the money that the government claims is going to Indigenous companies is actually going to shell companies and not Indigenous companies. And we've just read recently in the news a great example of this with the company owned by Randy Boissonnault. And even though GHI was not listed on the Indigenous Business Directory, and you made mention of that, I think your departmental officials know differently and have agreed that they are still eligible to receive funding from ISC. We've also heard that there are little to no consequences for companies who pretend to be Indigenous. And I want to quote Shannon Mehta-Tawabin, CEO of the National Aboriginal Capital Corporations Association. And they would have stated that there are very little penalties and that there need to be penalties for sure. And he actually went on to say it's criminal behavior to conduct fraud. So we have to take other steps and demonstrate to the world and to Canada that those actors who are engaging in this activity don't use this window and this program to access the federal government in a bad way. Do you agree that it's criminal behavior and that there should be penalties?
First of all, what I would say is I think we're saying the same thing in that Indigenous business procurement is a really critical aspect of Canada's economic growth. And we have to take
Minister,
it seriously.
I
And,
asked a very direct question.
and I'm going to give you a very direct answer.
Then I would ask you to get to that answer, please.
Great. And as I was saying, and that's why it's so important that we ensure that there isn't fraud in the space of claiming indigeneity. Now, as you know, Indigenous Services Canada.
Minister, my question was, do you believe it's criminal behavior when a non-Indigenous company claims to be Indigenous to steal money from Indigenous-owned companies through the set-aside?
What I would say is that fraud is fraud, and we do have an office that can look into claims of fraudulent behavior and apply a variety of penalties. And so I can't specifically give a general sweeping statement because, of course, different companies have different circumstances. But I would expect that anyone who's contracting through the federal government ensure that the laws of the land are upheld, including ensuring that fraud is not rewarded.
Thank you. Thank you. So Randy Boissonnault is a cabinet minister in the government of Canada. He's your colleague. He falsely claimed to be Indigenous in order to steal money set aside for Indigenous-owned businesses. As the Minister of Indigenous Services, will you commit to holding your colleague to account for running a company that falsely claimed to be Indigenous?
Well, as you know, first of all, I just want to reiterate that any false claims of indigeneity hurts the goal that I think you are obviously in favor of, which is increasing Indigenous economic activity in this country. And so,
as
I
the,
would
as
say,
the minister,
I would say that
as the Minister of Indigenous Services, what will you do to hold your cabinet colleague to account for trying to defraud the government of Canada by claiming to be an Indigenous-owned business when they weren't?
I think I've been clear that Mr. Boissonnault's company has never been on the list. and I
That's not the
believe-
question I'm asking. His actions speak for themselves. He claimed to be Indigenous. He claimed to be running an Indigenous business in order to access the set-aside that was meant for Indigenous-owned businesses. Will you join other members of Parliament in calling for his resignation? This file falls directly under your authority. And if you can go back to the Indigenous communities in your riding and tell them that he should not be held to account, that what he does was just fine, I think they will have something to say about that. You are the Minister of Indigenous Services. You have ministerial accountability. And when you know for fact that one of your colleagues has defrauded or attempted to defraud the government of Canada by claiming to be an Indigenous-owned business for the sole purpose of accessing something that they shouldn't have access to, I think you have a duty to call that member to account, especially when it falls under your jurisdiction as a minister.
Well, I'm really excited that
I'm
we're
sorry,
talking about my riding,
have
but
to
obviously
interrupt.
my
That
time
is our
is up, so I
time.
won't